Last week saw the premiere of Skeleton Crew, the latest Star Wars streaming series, this time from John Watts and his frequent collaborator Christopher Ford. The show premiered with a double bill, a full quarter of the 8-episode run that will carry the show across this financial quarter into the new year, while hopefully retaining Disney Plus subscribers through the holiday season. I can tell you very simply what it is. It is a Star Wars reimagining of Treasure Island, with Jude Law playing Captain Silvo, and droid first mate SM-33, which I guess is pronounced Sm-3. Like a lot of Watt's output, including his directorial debut Cop Car and his first Marvel movie Spider-Man Homecoming, it is heavily indebted to the beloved children's movies of the 1980s. Stories of latchkey kids going on magical adventures like E.T., The Goonies, Flight of the Navigator, and of course, most importantly, Mac and Me. However, I can't really tell you whether the show itself is any good. I can tell you that the opening 2 episodes are very heavy on exposition and setup, are populated by archetypes more than characters, and take a frankly frustrating amount of time to start laying down the law, if you know what I mean. Hey Jude, don't make it bad. But I can't really tell you anything about the season as a whole because Disney only screened the show's first 3 episodes for critics, and the nature of Skeleton Crew is that it's very obviously a movie that's been carved up and released in 8 parts. So this week we're going to go a bit inside baseball. We're going to pull back the curtain and talk a little bit about the art of criticism in the age of streaming franchises. We're going to talk about why it's so difficult to actually and substantively talk about the quality of these shows, how it affects the discourse around these properties, and why this approach is ultimately doing more harm than good. I guess you could say I have a skeleton of opinions about this. They've really accrued over time. Yeah, I believe that's a pretty impressive opening salvo of puns. That's Jude Law's character's name. Look, before we begin, I know that nobody likes the guy who actually enjoys his work, but I gotta say it. Being a cultural critic is the best job in the world. It is an immense privilege. You get to watch movies and television shows, think about them, write about them, have constructive arguments about them, and you get to work with some of the best people in the world, like for example, editors Jesse and Omar. Sure, occasionally you have to talk about Borderlands for a video, or your editor insists on 2,000 words on Night Swim, the movie about a killer swimming pool. But that's a small price to pay in the grand scheme of things.
Let's start with Arnold Schwarzenegger's latest film, Rabbi P.I. It's the story of a Chicago cop who goes undercover as a Hasidic Jew.
Generally speaking, the job works exactly as you would expect it to. You see a movie, you think about it, and then you talk about it and or write about it. It's a fairly linear process. As a rule, when you're reviewing a movie, you've generally seen the whole thing in toto from beginning to end. And if you're watching the recent Yacht Rock documentary from HBO, you've definitely seen toto from beginning to end. This is why I'm honestly quite skeptical of anybody offering a critical opinion of a movie that they walked out of. I mean, it's their choice, of course, but they're not really making an informed criticism of the work. Television is a little different. Generally speaking, when launching a new show, a broadcaster will provide you with a couple of episodes to give you a flavor of what the show is and how it works, so you can share an opinion on or a recommendation of it. This works reasonably well for traditional episodic or even lightly serialized television. I don't need to see every episode of, say, Poker Face, for example, to offer an opinion on it, because if you show me 4 episodes of that show, I get a sense of how an average episode works, how the cast plays off one another, and the quality of the production as a whole. As a critic, I can reasonably extrapolate that across a full season, working from a modest sample size that includes highs and lows. This doesn't really work the same way with the stereotypical modern streaming show. There are exceptions, of course, but many of these shows are effectively structured to be 4 to 8 hour movies that have been cut into arbitrary chunks of content soup. New York Times critic James Poniewozik argued that streaming was a new medium. Alan Sepinwall has written at length about the erosion of the traditional television episode as a cohesive unit of narrative, as it was even back during The Sopranos or Mad Men, the early days of serialized television. To give credit where it's due, many of these streaming services like Netflix or Paramount or Max or Apple or Amazon will provide critics with entire seasons for the purpose of writing their pre-air review. If a season of television is going to effectively be one long movie, it makes sense for critics to get to see the end of that movie before being asked to offer a blanket recommendation or opinion. If that's not possible, for example in very effects-heavy shows, the broadcaster or studio will often provide as many episodes as possible, often adding new ones as they're finished. In some cases, as with the first season of The Last of Us or The Penguin, the studio might provide critics with unfinished cuts of later episodes, allowing the critic to see how the show pays off certain central relationships and story threads. The idea is that this will allow critics to speak confidently to audiences about whether it's worth making the several-month commitment to the series. This is in the interest of the show, assuming that the broadcaster thinks that they have something worthwhile. And look, to talk specifically about myself, that's why I felt as comfortable as I did championing both shows, because I could be sure that they didn't fumble the ball in the home stretch of the court. That was a sports metaphor, right? I'm cool. And look, sometimes this approach doesn't work out. The Day of the Jackal and Hysteria didn't become better television shows because I watched every episode before the premiere. And it kinda sucks when I've wasted 8 hours doing that. But it does generally help a critic to both feel more comfortable in rendering an informed assessment of the text as a whole, and to make a more coherent argument for what the show actually is, what it is about, and what it means. Something like, say, Alfonso Cuarón's disclaimer only reveals itself in its ending. It makes it easier to have conversations around these things. Hell, even outside of recommendation, there's an argument that the critic serves to prepare the audience, to properly contextualize and even frame the show.
Even Satan himself would love this angel hair pasta. It's a good buy. And so goodbye from Mr. Good Guy, Gene Shalit.
Disney generally don't do this with their franchise fare, their Star Wars or Marvel shows. They typically only screen a couple of early episodes for critics, which is effectively like asking a critic to render an opinion after watching the first act of a movie. And let me tell you, watched that way, Gone Girl plays very differently. I can only assume that the second half of Psycho follows Marion Crane driving back home to return that money she stole. Right? And look, the backdrop never has been and never will be a big, shouty, angry show. This is not me complaining that I haven't seen all of the new Disney Star Wars show or whatever. The World's Smallest Violin was unfortunately pre-booked, so we couldn't get to play there. This is awards season. I have enough to keep me busy. At the end of recording this, I have to go watch screeners of a documentary about making Hamlet in Grand Theft Auto, and also watch the Best Picture contender September 5th. Tomorrow I'm going to see Night Bitch, the movie in which Amy Adams believes she's turning into a dog. And honestly, not showing me all of Skeleton Crew just makes it easier for me to recommend shows that I have seen all the episodes of, like Creature Commandos, the new animated James Gunn show on Max, or The Agency on Paramount Plus, in which Michael Fassbender is the spy who loved me just a little bit too much. To be quite frank, I'm a little glad that Disney took this obligation off my plate for me. I'm not really going to have a cohesive opinion on Skeleton Crew until it's over, and I find the time to watch it, by which point the cultural conversation will have moved on, and crucially so will have Disney. They will have made the decision to renew or cancel the show, and will have framed it as a success or a failure before anybody can actually make a clear statement of what it ultimately was. And I'm not pretending that my opinion makes or breaks the gigantic franchise show, but it is also cumulative. I'm not the only critic. I'm not even a particularly important critic. But it helps to have critics framing and shaping the conversation.
It stinks.
Of course, there are various reasons why Disney might not typically screen these franchise shows in full for critics. There is a modern obsession with spoilers, leaks, and piracy. Although to be honest, that last one seems like a perfect fit for Skeleton Crew.
Why did you bring us to a pirate port full of pirates?
Because we are also pirates.
But these problems don't really tend to come from critics. Critics are generally quite good at keeping important secrets. Indeed, there was a minor controversy back in February 2005 when some pundits complained that critics had been too good at keeping the big twist in Clint Eastwood's $1 Million Baby secret from audiences. You didn't need a spoiler embargo. Although, I will tell you the twist. Psst. The secret was that Clint Eastwood's character was a bad dad.
I'm not supposed to tell him. Don't rat me out.
The second reason why Disney might not screen these shows for critics might be an effort to control the discussion around these shows. After all, the internet is full of loud and shouty people with opinions about Star Wars or Marvel or whatever, and so Disney might want to limit the amount of access people have to try to avoid particularly massive controversies. Of course, there's a paradox here. in that this decision makes it very hard for professionals to talk about these shows substantively, which creates a vacuum which is filled by these loud and shouty people who are ultimately arguing about nothing substantive. That said, there's also perhaps a more cynical tertiary factor at play here, which is the tendency of these shows to completely fall apart in the home stretch.
You didn't kill Anakin Skywalker. I did.
It's fairly easy to launch a show competently. It's fairly handy to start a story that is interesting. It's very easy to throw a set of balls into the air, it's just somewhat harder to catch them all. Although, to be honest, this also contributes to my own general reluctance, and I suspect other critics' growing reluctance, to offer any strong enthusiastic opinion on these early episodes without seeing how they pay off. Once burnt, 27th shy. And this approach is self-sabotaging for Disney. This year, Agatha All Along got off to a very slow and very boring start in the episodes that were screened for critics. Its best episode was its season finale, but I didn't know that when I shrugged it off based on whatever was shown to me. The first season, The Acolyte, for example, is actually a fascinatingly structured piece of work with lots of mirroring and twinning throughout in terms of episode structure, title, and plot points. But it's impossible to know that based on the paint-by-numbers premiere screen for critics, which was functionally indistinguishable from Obi-Wan Kenobi or the Book of Boba Fett. Ultimately, if critics can't make big-picture arguments about these shows, they just cede ground to angry, shouty people who don't feel like they need to view a whole object to render an authoritative opinion on it. This seems counterproductive to having a good conversation. But then again, I don't know if any of this actually matters. It's all very inside baseball. It's a glimpse of how the sausage is made. But I hope that this glimpse behind the curtain was at least interesting and demonstrates the peculiarities of media criticism in the modern streaming age. It is a changing landscape, and I find myself thinking increasingly about the mechanics of how we do what we do.
Oh, I have no fans. Most of my viewers are drunken frat boys who like to make fun of me.
Hey, look, he's picking his nose.
Hopefully I've given you a bit more of a holistic view about how this whole thing works. I've been Darren Mooney, and I hope that I helped you get a closer look at the backdrop.